Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webcast and for your interest in the notions of sovereignty and the Belt Road Initiative. Before I begin my talk, I would like to thank Carol Weiss, professor in the International Relations School at USC, and Clayton Dube from the USC US-China Institute for their very kind invitation to participate in this year's speaker series on China. As a political and economic geographer, my research and fieldwork focuses on Chinese trade, investment, and loan making beyond China's borders, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. So in my talk today, while I will be discussing China's relationship to sovereignty in terms of the Belt Road Initiative, if any of you have any questions regarding Chinese-Latin American relations, I'd be happy to entertain questions at the end of this talk. So let's get started. Today I would like to speak with you about sovereignty regimes and the Belt Road Initiative. Historical and conventional international relations frameworks describe the Belt Road Initiative as representing a newly ambitious Chinese drive into global politics that positions China as moving away from its longtime reticence towards foreign entanglements. So this raises a contradiction of China being at one and the same time both a defender of its own territorial sovereignty, while also being engaged in various projects, particularly the BRI and the closely associated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that point in completely different directions. This project seeks to build upon and move beyond conventional framings to understand how the BRI represents a conflict over the workings of state sovereignty that such frameworks have trouble addressing. This project argues that the absence of a singular, official Chinese government Belt Road Initiative map promotes a quote-unquote useful fuzziness with regards to China being open to crafting a new, as of yet undefined geopolitical identity. In light of the absence of an official BRI map, it is worth considering key ideas relating to China's geopolitical expansion via the BRI in terms of so-called sovereignty regimes. This is a term and a phrase that political geographer John Agnew coined in 2005 to describe the various practices of authority and control emanating originally from states that take on different geographical shapes. Conflicts arise when a state, such as China, finds itself caught between the operational imperatives of multiple sovereignty regimes or multiple ways of organizing sovereignty geographically. In other words, the likelihood for geopolitical tensions arising with the growth and geographic expansion of the BRI involves Chinese historical familiarity with and preference for classic sovereignty, a sovereignty where the territory of a country or a state is consolidated by a strong central government. This clashes with the reality of being open to other BRI partner countries' legal frameworks, norms, and institutions. Such a reality of being connected to other countries through economic and political partnerships is a necessity when thinking about a global type framework. Also, at the time when Chinese President Xi Jinping is keen on creating new governance norms rather than following old ones, and he seeks to do so on a global rather than on a domestic scale, I agree with Elizabeth Economy's observation that one of the great paradoxes of China today involves Xi Jinping's effort to position himself as a champion of globalization on the one hand, while at the same time restricting the free flow of capital, information, and goods between China and the rest of the world on the other hand. By identifying current sovereignty regime dynamics raised by the BRI in light of the relevant yet distinctive historical experience of the Marshall Plan, this work can be used as a model for understanding how China's current leadership is managing the debate of simultaneously protecting strong borders, yet also promoting a policy of going out that is engaging politically and economically with other countries. The absence of a singular official Chinese government map of the BRI may be an intentional move on the part of leadership in Beijing to open the future relationship between China and countries and localities associated with BRI projects, and preventing the bordering of a newly emerging regime such as the BRI, whose ultimate shape is still very much unknown, can help to minimize cartographic anxieties, a term that scholars have used to describe the geopolitical tensions that arise with the printing of maps. The Chinese government's ongoing publication and reproduction of the 9-dash line in the South China Sea is an ongoing geopolitical controversy that Chinese leaders most likely do not wish to relive with the emergent BRI. So given the current unbordered framework of the BRI, here I use the concept of sovereignty regimes as a way of analyzing 4 possible governance frameworks that the nascent BRI may eventually adopt. That the BRI is not a single plan at all, and that the official BRI website, shown here, lacks a detailed explanation of the plan's goals, further contributes to this initiative's undefined nature. In fact, one of the key misunderstandings of the BRI relates to the conceptualization of the project as comprising a well-defined, fixed, and predetermined set of maritime and land routes and transects, as many cartographic images depict. The reality, however, points toward an ambiguity surrounding the future of Chinese sovereignty, namely the shape of Chinese power. Many maps appear in articles about the BRI, but they are not based on empirical data. They just convey directional gestures associated with the Silk Road language, anchored in a few nodes. And this is an example of what geographers call misplaced geographical concreteness. And this really implies that more is known about the initiative as a whole and what it has achieved so far than is actually in fact the case. The BRI cannot, at this stage, be accurately and verifiably mapped because what it currently represents geopolitically is still very much unknown. So, employing the notion of sovereignty regimes, which are geographic representations of political power, is one way of exploring the geopolitical possibilities of the still nascent set of Chinese government-inspired infrastructural and institutional frameworks that make up the BRI. Sovereignty regimes then constitute a framework for explaining the principal ways in which sovereignty, defined as the authority of a state that it has to govern itself or other states, is currently practiced. Sovereignty regimes account for the comparative strength of centralized state authority and the degree to which such authority is consolidated in the territory of a state. The 4 idealized types of sovereignty regimes here are classic, imperialist, integrative, and globalist. While matching China to one of these 4 idealized types of sovereignty regimes, shown on this table, is not the aim of this project, such a framework is meant to highlight the different shapes sovereignty can take given the uncertain trajectory of China's handling of sovereignty. Addressing the still evolving BRI through the sovereignty regimes framework helps us to chart out 4 possible directions the Chinese state may take as the Chinese Communist Party attempts to navigate the fine line of altering a global system it views as overly Western, while simultaneously trying to appease claims of Chinese neo-imperialism. Now, let's walk through these 4 sovereignty regime types. Let's start off with the classic regime. The classic regime is similar to the doctrine of mercantilism in its totalizing of territorial borders and its emphasis on central state regulation of all transactions entering and leaving a state's home territory. Up until the early 2000s, when China joined the World Trade Organization and when it began being thought of in terms of being a responsible stakeholder in global politics, and when it saw its geoeconomic interests following connections beyond China's borders, up until this time, China embodied the classical sovereignty regime with power over society and power through society still largely deployed within its bounded state territory. Next, the imperialist regime can be viewed as the opposite of the classic sovereignty regime, in that it emphasizes hierarchy in world politics, but with a networked reach over space. And this organizational setup increasingly supplements or replaces direct territorial control. So this regime type questions state authority and questions central state authority as it relies on the cooperation of local elites in other countries. Regions such as Latin America, which have had a historically dependent political economic status with the global north, exemplify this imperialist sovereignty regime. The third regime, integrative, highlights the overlapping nature of sovereignty relating to the coexistence between different levels or tiers of government through different national, subnational, and local scales. This regime type is best exemplified by the European Union. The integrative regime represents an at times politically unclassifiable entity that challenges traditional or classic state sovereignty in functionality, complex, and oftentimes non-territorial ways. The final regime, the globalist regime, can be understood as effective sovereignty exercised by a geopolitical hegemon within and beyond its nominal national boundaries through international institutions within which it is particularly influential. And this regime, the globalist regime, is exemplified by the United States since the end of World War II and by Britain in the 1800s. The globalist sovereignty regime attempts to enroll other states into a hegemon's governing authority through free-willed participation. This regime is noteworthy because it envisions and encapsulates the idea that sovereignty is borderless, in other words, global. Interpreting these 4 regimes highlights the sovereignty challenges and contradictions presented by the growth and expansion of the BRI. So how does the Belt Road Initiative fit into these 4 sovereignty regime types? I argue that the forces driving the BRI involve realizing the Chinese dream, improving China's international economic connectivity, and enhancing China's global infrastructural investment and trade. And these 3 forces combine and reflect on 3 factors that highlight and remind us of a possible way that the BRI could follow and develop into in the future. These factors include China's desire to regain its historical centrality in world affairs. This concept follows the imperialist sovereignty regime. China's quest to address its humiliation by prior foreign invasion. This concept addresses the classic sovereignty regime. And China's aspirational determination to address its current state of being surrounded by US allies in Asia by attempting to enroll other states via the BRI infrastructural and AIIB financial institutions. And this last point represents the globalist regime. So using this sovereignty regime's framework directly addresses the geopolitical contradictions that the Chinese government faces, and I seek to build on William Callahan's call to view the type of connectivity represented by the BRI as, quote, more than an issue of the hardware of physical infrastructure, but rather it is also a software issue of the connectivity of ideas, institutions, and behavior in diplomacy itself, end quote. Considering the BRI framework in terms of sovereignty regimes is especially timely. The BRI's expansion beyond East Asia has sprouted important debates that are shaping geopolitics today. Political debates relating to Chinese leadership's position towards sovereign maritime claims and the fear of financial indebtedness on the part of countries receiving Chinese financing are all shaping the way in which Chinese interests are viewed geopolitically. The current US administration is helping to roll back its own global influence, and this equates to leaving the field open for China to shape and expand the BRI. I argue that the BRI is a political economic encapsulation of China's leadership's desire to manage these tensions by promoting a new geopolitical identity for itself, a new aspirational globalist sovereignty regime identity. But is such an arrangement even possible or sustainable? Perhaps because of the absence of an official map delimiting the BRI as a Eurasian or Africa-only political economic project, rhetoric surrounding this initiative has already adopted a borderless and expansionist flavor to include a Pacific Silk Road, a Silk Road on ice that crosses the Arctic Ocean, and a digital Silk Road through cyberspace. The globalist sovereignty regime places emphasis on the lack of borders and on the willing enrollment of participants into a hegemon's global vision. Key terms such as belt and road are intended to connect large swaths of territory and may serve to encourage BRI participant countries to coordinate their activities in a borderless fashion. To this end, the BRI has been variously referred to as a, quote, geofunctionalist institutionalist project and a, quote, alternative idea showing how the common space of international politics could be organized in the future, and as a, quote, possibly unique opportunity to reassert itself as the center of regional, if not world affairs, and, quote, the means to the much larger end of promoting China's new vision of global governance, end quote. One of the challenges surrounding the development of the BRI as a globalist sovereignty regime that would be attractive to Chinese neighbors is trying to convince partnering countries that this initiative is in fact globalist in nature, as has been stated explicitly by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2017. The goal then is to foster regional cooperation, which involves the building of consensus through rules and participation, and is really the hallmark of the globalist sovereignty regime. However, as this slide shows, long-standing historical anxieties that exist in societies near or neighboring China help to underscore the challenges that proponents of the BRI as a quote-unquote globalist sovereignty regime face. In Mongolia, for example, anxieties about China's economic influence go beyond recent and contemporary political economic issues and are tied to memories of the Qing dynasty. Such historical concerns contribute to modern-day worries over declining sovereignty, triggered by Chinese and other actors' participation in Mongolia's mining sector, and pose a significant roadblock towards the BRI evolving into a globalist sovereignty regime. In Nepal, while Chinese infrastructure projects do play a key role in helping the Nepali government solidify its authority and enhance its national security, the major new infrastructure projects are promised as the long-awaited vehicles that will finally deliver wealth and modernization across Nepal, and yet similar promises have been made and have been left unfulfilled for decades. So this history of unattained development in Nepal promises and deserves consideration and warrants pause among those who advocate that the BRI will develop into a globalist regime structure. Other examples of Chinese commercial activity beyond China's borders serve to question the overarching power of China's ability to enroll and entice people to accept and participate in BRI institutions. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, it is oftentimes the flexible entrepreneurial strategies of individual Chinese people and not the Chinese state that play an important and significant role in Chinese-Kyrgyzstani cross-border trade dynamics. Finally, in Myanmar, nationalistic movements suggest that the BRI plan has a complex array of social and political hurdles that need to be addressed if this initiative is to find acceptance in China's near-abroad regions. So for all of those reasons, it is still unclear if the BRI can or will evolve into a globalist sovereignty regime. Although less likely, the possibility of the BRI becoming an integrative sovereignty regime deserves some consideration. This regime allows for the coexistence between different levels of government, and such a framework could range from BRI-wide to Chinese national to subnational or regional political organizations. While it is true that China is currently governed by an assemblage of political actors, the increasing consolidation of power by Xi Jinping himself suggests that this framework, this integrative sovereignty regime framework, may not align with the policy goals and national visions of China's current leadership. Now let's consider the BRI in relation to the classic sovereignty regime. First off, however, there is an inherent paradox and difficulty in developing the BRI into a globalist sovereignty regime, given Chinese leadership's track record of deploying a classic sovereignty regime. Classic sovereignty regime is one in which political power is territorially bounded by the borders of a state. Classic sovereignty, then, is the regime most often invoked when depicting traditional state sovereignty. It is a regime that depends on a high degree of centralized government political authority, and it is easily understood since this regime, power and control are limited to the geographic boundaries of a state. Two geopolitically turbulent examples highlight Beijing's preoccupation with this classic sovereignty regime type. First, the July 2016 ruling in favor of the Philippines by the International Arbitral Tribunal in the South China Sea case highlights the deep concern about maintaining and reclaiming national territory while seeking to be a responsible geopolitical stakeholder. By viewing itself as the rightful sovereign authority over the South China Sea, China's leadership is signaling its ongoing preoccupation with traditional concepts of control over state territory. And second, China's humiliation at the hands of foreigners from the 1840s to the 1940s, specifically the carving up of China's territory by European and other powers, is a central part of the official history that is taught in Chinese school. This humiliation serves as a reminder of the subservience that follows from a failure to respond adequately to foreign threats and to defend China's borders against colonial dismemberment. Beginning in the late 1940s, Mao Zedong restored Chinese national sovereignty from foreign colonial powers by unifying the country, a clear move in the direction of the classic sovereignty regime. So these two examples, highlighted and depicted visually on this slide, together with the growth of the Chinese economy since the late 1970s, has strengthened China's geopolitical presence as a state in support of the classic state sovereignty regime. Leadership in Beijing may also be shaping its new political vision around principles aligned with an imperialist sovereignty regime. Unlike the globalist and classic sovereignty regimes, the imperialist variety relies on a neo-tributary framework, which involves the Chinese historic tributary tradition as a means of shaping China's contemporary global power strategy. The Mandarin saying, everything under heavens, 天下, highlights China's historical worldview and China's experience with infrastructural connectivity is offered to weaker neighbors as both a form of assistance and as a form of power, showing China's power. The Neo-Tributary perspective identifies China's exceptionalism, trade and diplomacy linkages, and image building as a way of acknowledging the needs and aspirations of China's contemporary diplomacy from a non-Western Chinese perspective. The contemporary relevance of the Neo-Tributary perspective, that is this imperialist perspective, as an aid in situating China's place in the world, aligns well with China's traditional view of itself as a cultural core expanding outward. Deeply embedded in the imperialist sovereignty regime is a belief in and an adherence to soft power on the part of Chinese leadership. Chinese leadership views soft power in ways that are different from Western views of soft power. Chinese views of soft power encompass not only popular culture and public diplomacy, but also more coercive economic and diplomatic levers like aid and investment and participation in multilateral organizations. Furthermore, China's fixation on its cultural and not only its political and military strength further lends credence to the validity of the tribute system or tributary system as the best way to ensure that it is able to maintain national face and a sense of overall superiority. Taken together then, these factors suggest that designing and maintaining the BRI as an imperialist sovereignty regime will be more likely than its institutionalization as a globalist sovereignty regime. This regime classification aligns well with China's psychological worldview of interactions between states being best understood as relational and bilateral. Recent activity of Chinese state-owned enterprises with regards to European and Eurasian infrastructure and infrastructural projects in Eurasia further support the BRI as aligning with the imperialist more than the globalist sovereignty regime. Characterized by networked reach over space, as well as direct territorial control, this imperialist sovereignty regime entails the deployment of sovereignty as necessarily tied to the dependent political economic status that many states endure. In 2017, for instance, the Sri Lankan government, having taken on $1.5 billion of Chinese debt for the construction of a seaport at the town of Hambantota, decided to grant control of the port to Beijing. The 70% controlling interest that China now has of the port for the next 99 years has been described as a, quote, strategic move to advance China's BRI goals, something the Chinese firm at the center of the deal has been explicit about, end quote. This deal has raised concerns about the eventual arrival of Chinese naval vessels, a move that would support the use of the imperialist sovereignty regime to characterize the BRI. Of the three sovereignty regimes challenging the globalist regime as a potential explanatory concept for the emergent BRI, this imperialist sovereignty regime represents a direct challenge to Chinese leadership's ability to manage the political and economic tensions associated with the Chinese state, promoting a new, borderless geopolitical identity for itself. In the case of the Marshall Plan, most post-World War II Western European countries were eager to cooperate with the US government because US grants were given in a political atmosphere of post-war governmental as much as infrastructural rebuilding. The following and the next few slides will compare and contrast the US Marshall Plan with the Chinese BRI in an attempt to clarify the overarching geopolitical uncertainty associated with the latter. Broad political economic comparisons of the Marshall Plan and the BRI have placed emphasis on both plans being put forward at times when the world system was not functioning properly. Both initiatives must be understood as entailing a mix of economic and geopolitical objectives, which together can be seen as a proactive responses by strong state actors to major sea changes in the geopolitical landscape at the time of their formation. The Marshall Plan was the prototype of the globalist sovereignty regime after the Second World War, and its emphasis on governance more than just on infrastructure has helped to consolidate the staying power of this Western-led world order, to this day. Although seeking a different pathway, I argue that the evolution of the BRI is happening in a geopolitical system that has been indelibly shaped by the Marshall Plan. Whereas the key geopolitical driver forging the creation of the Marshall Plan was the rebuilding of a shattered Europe following World War II in an effort to thwart Europe from falling under Soviet domination. At the broadest levels, these factors serve as a reminder of the contested nature of Chinese sovereignty, especially in an era where economic clout is enabling China to question the dominant world order as crafted by the American and European governments that has been in place since 1944. Comparing the Marshall Plan and the BRI highlights the way in which contemporary geopolitics is shifting away from a US or European-based international regulatory framework towards a more Chinese-influenced world order, as this slide highlights. Such a comparison also serves to highlight the importance of sovereignty regimes in a dynamic geopolitical system that often bends to those state actors who have a monopoly on power and a monopoly on power through society. While it is clear that the Marshall Plan represented the globalist sovereignty regime, I argue that it is still too early to tell, and there are too many complexities to determine which type of sovereignty regime the Belt Road Initiative will most closely mimic. Although the Chinese government does not favor the comparison between these two initiatives, since it views the Marshall Plan as a contributing factor in the containment of the Soviet Union, even though the US did not initially set out to do this, the main geopolitical motives of each plan have and will continue to have global implications. And so the framing ideas found in both of these initiatives include open membership to all interested and willing parties, the global use and adoption of American and Chinese products and ideas respectively, and a strong and clear emphasis on multilateralism. The way that the BRI is articulated by the Chinese government is a system of mutual benefit for all of its participant countries and for the entire world. There are challenges, however, to the BRI being willingly accepted by diverse groups of people and by diverse groups of actors. The problem with this projection of the BRI is that the way the Chinese Communist Party has treated other groups that do not follow the Chinese government's directives ranging from Chinese political dissidents such as Liu Xiaobo and Hu Jia to countries on the South China Sea such as Vietnam, who have overlapping claims to islands and waters in the region, has not been conducive and has not been conducted with utmost benevolence toward the quote-unquote other. In addition to the growing U.S.-Chinese geopolitical rivalry, in which regulators increasingly seek to investigate and discredit BRI-related financing, the rise in importance of Chinese state-owned enterprises, SOEs, as the vehicles through which Xi Jinping is promoting Chinese self-reliance, only serves to complicate notions that the BRI represents China's international development strategy, namely globalization 2.0. Xi's recent use of the term self-reliance in relation to the larger role SOEs will play in guiding the Chinese economy suggests a fuzziness which, similar to the lack of an official BRI map, may be a way to buy time to strategize the best approach to take for the still evolving cohort of BRI projects. The original Maoist idea of self-reliance emphasized isolation from exploitative capitalist and Western forces, while Deng Xiaoping and others used the term to promote greater integration in the world economy. The recent CCP decision to insert the Communist Party into the bylaws of China's largest corporations represents another factor challenging the view of the BRI as a potentially globalist enterprise. This decision is likely to increasingly bring Chinese non-state actors under the canopy of the Chinese government's umbrella of power. Perhaps not surprisingly, the development and deployment of investment and infrastructural connectivity programs into BRI-affiliated states is characterized by contradictions. Such contradictions further complicate the sovereignty regime designation of China's BRI. And although Western biases may suggest that Chinese state-owned enterprises are more likely to seek out investment locations in other authoritarian regimes, recent scholarship doesn't support such a claim. China's national oil companies, for example, seek out investment locations that have fewer regulatory hurdles and a track record of long-term stability. A key factor enabling China's national oil companies to take such actions involves the CCP's willingness to shift the locus of risk away from Beijing and squarely into the firm itself. And while such a stance contradicts insertions of the CCP into China's largest firms, this also suggests that pathways other than a full-fledged imperialist sovereignty regime are a possibility for Chinese government-affiliated actors moving forward. This contradiction raises the question, how can Beijing allow a loosening of control for Chinese firms beyond China's borders and still maintain a high degree of economic and political authority over such firms and actors along the lines of classic sovereignty within China's territorial boundaries? Likewise, recent deaths of Chinese workers in Pakistan highlight the conflicts at play over the workings of notions of classical versus globalist state sovereignty in relationship to the BRI. On the one hand, China's contemporary political economic advance is centered around building Chinese classic sovereignty, strength, power, and influence. But on the other hand, Chinese sources have readily admitted to the reality that the BRI projects in Pakistan will bring the deaths of many Chinese workers here as a part of China's push to create a new geopolitical identity. In short, the limits to China's shaping the BRI into an alternative globalist regime appear to be numerous and mounting. So in conclusion, this project asks the question, How can China, as a modern state, defend its borders as its main priority, yet also support a growing role for itself and other Chinese actors in the world at large? The answer to this question involves simultaneously leveraging China's strengths and experiences in government-to-government deal-making, entrepreneurial flexibility, learning, adaptation and innovativeness, infrastructural construction, and project finance to enroll other states and other actors into the still evolving Belt Road Initiative. That these projects and pathways have not been enshrined in a singular official cartographic statement first points to a continued expansion of the BRI, and second may serve to lessen antagonism toward China by already wary neighbors and far-off rivals. Such an open, still undefined cartography represents the CCP's attempt to encourage what it hopes will be a globalist regime that will evolve and develop naturally and organically without any predetermined political borders, boundaries, or limits. As discussed here today, such hopes are complicated by an array of sovereignty-related factors. That there is no one official Chinese government BRI map is suggestive of the rhetorical role of the BRI. Only when precise delimitation becomes possible will we be able to see whether this is a new globalist, imperialist, or integrated project. In any of these cases, the first sign would have to be a clear abandonment of the classic sovereignty regime that China seems intent on furthering. So this concludes my presentation for today, and I would like to thank everyone for tuning in, and I would be happy to address any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you.